The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 8 Reciprocity, Mutual Regulation. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, a mirror linguistic hypothesis series, Volume 3, The Silencing Field, Return to Self. Episode 8 Reciprocity, Mutual Regulation. We are entering a different phase of this return. Reciprocity is the new focus, shifting the work beyond isolated self-restoration. We're moving into a phase where the core challenge is not improvement, repair, or better communication, but rather what unfolds when a regulated self engages with the field. This signifies a time when authentic contact no longer depends on control. Reciprocity, as it appears here, is not a relationship skill, not an ethical posture, not something you perform to create harmony. Reciprocity is a physiological condition that becomes possible only after agency has stabilized. Because without agency, contact is never neutral. Without agency, contact becomes negotiation. Without agency, contact becomes pressure. Without agency, contact becomes a timing asymmetry disguised as communication. One nervous system rushes, the other adapts. One collapses time, the other manages consequences. And both people call it personality, attachment style, conflict, chemistry, or love. But the body knows what is actually happening. Regulation is occurring unevenly. So this episode begins by removing the romance from reciprocity and placing it back where it belongs, in biology. Reciprocity begins when no one is rushing the moment. That is the threshold. It is not agreement, not understanding, and not harmony, but timing. When timing is coerced, contact becomes control. When timing is uneven, one system carries the cost. When timing collapses, urgency enters the space and begins selecting behavior. That is not mutuality, that is recruitment. Volume 3 has been restoring the conditions that make this visible. Stillness ended compulsive motion. Sensation returned to the body as a signal. Orientation restored the place and context. Discernment separated the signal from the noise. Boundary returned the edge. Voice allowed expression without performance. Agency restored choice without urgency. Now we cross into phase 3, titled Resonant Participation. Not participation as compliance. Not participation as performance. Participation as presence, where the self can remain intact while entering contact. Reciprocity is the first test of that because the moment you stop rushing, the field responds. Sometimes it softens, sometimes it escalates. Sometimes it reveals who was depending on your urgency to function. This is not failure, this is information. Reciprocity does not mean things become easier. It means they become clearer. When agency is restored, you no longer need to manage the field to stay safe. You no longer need to speak to regulate someone else's reaction. You no longer need to adjust your timing to prevent escalation. You no longer need to disappear to maintain a connection. But the field may still be organized around speed, pressure, and immediate response. And when your nervous system no longer complies with that demand, the difference becomes visible. Reciprocity exposes timing asymmetry. It shows you where one system has been leading and the other adapting. It shows you where urgency has been doing the regulating instead of presence. It shows you where communication problems are actually regulation failures. Not because someone is wrong, but because the conditions for mutual regulation were never in place. This is why reciprocity cannot be forced. You cannot will another nervous system into safety. You cannot explain to someone into pausing. You cannot regulate for two without cost. Reciprocity only appears when both systems can hold timing without collapse, when both can pause without panic, when neither needs to hurry the moment to feel safe. This is not a romantic statement. It is a structural one. Two nervous systems can only regulate together if each can tolerate uncertainty independently. Agency is what makes that possible. Agency restores the option. Option restores timing. Timing restores response. Response restores contact. Without agency, a relationship becomes a strategy. With agency, the relationship becomes participation. This is also where many people experience grief. Because when urgency leaves your system, you may realize how much of your connection was built on speed, fixing, explaining, soothing, or adapting. You may realize that what felt like closeness was actually you carrying regulation for the field. And when you stop doing that, the field reorganizes, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes painfully, sometimes honestly. Reciprocity does not guarantee harmony. It guarantees visibility. It shows you what happens when no one rushes. It shows you whether the space can hold two intact nervous systems without someone collapsing first. It shows you whether the contact is mutual or maintained by sacrifice. This episode is not about learning how to be reciprocal. It is about recognizing when reciprocity is possible and recognizing when it is not. Because both require agency, both require timing, both require the ability to remain present without forcing an outcome. As we move through this episode, we will map reciprocity as a somatic event, not a moral one. We will explore how bodies entrain, how timing synchronizes or fails to, how speech changes when it is no longer used to manage reaction, and how silence can either threaten or stabilize a field. We will look at what mutual regulation feels like, how it breaks down, and why it cannot be sustained when one system is still organized around urgency. For now, we place the opening truth cleanly. Reciprocity begins where urgency ends. It begins when no one is rushing the moment. And everything that follows: connection, conflict, intimacy, distance, clarity, and emerges from that single condition. The atmospheric hook, the moment the field softens, there is a moment that doesn't announce itself. No declaration, no insight, no agreement reached, nothing resolved. And yet the field changes. It happens when no one rushes. Two nervous systems occupy the same space, a room, a conversation, a silence, and for the first time, neither one tries to move the moment forward. No one fills the gap. No one tries to manage the tone. No one accelerates to prevent discomfort. The air doesn't thicken. The pause doesn't threaten. The space holds. That is the moment the field softens. Not because everything is safe. Not because everyone understands each other. But because urgency withdraws. And when urgency withdraws, a different physics appears. Most people have never been taught to recognize this moment. They have been trained to miss it. Trained to rush past it. Trained to override it with words, gestures, fixes, explanations, humor, intellect, reassurance. Because in many environments, a pause was not neutral. Pause was interpreted as danger. Silence meant something bad was about to happen. Delay meant you were about to be judged, abandoned, attacked, misunderstood, punished, or exposed. So the system learned to preempt. Speak early, decide fast, clarify immediately, smooth the edge, close the loop, keep things moving so nothing can land too hard. That training doesn't disappear just because you restore agency. It lingers in the field. It lingers in other people. It lingers in expectations that were built around your speed. So when urgency finally leaves your own system, the first thing you feel is not peace. You feel the absence of pressure. An absence can feel strange, even wrong, even dangerous, because the field has not yet learned that time is allowed. This section is not here to explain reciprocity. It's here to let you feel the difference between a field that is being managed and a field that is being met. Imagine a conversation that used to escalate. Not dramatically, subtly, a tone shift, a comment, a look, a silence that used to trigger a response. In the old pattern, one nervous system would move immediately. Clarify, defend, soften, push back, fix, anything to prevent the tension from expanding. Now imagine the same moment, but no one moves. Not frozen, present. The breath continues. The shoulders stay where they are. The jaw does not set. The throat does not prepare. The mind notices the impulse to speak and does not obey it. The silence stretches, but it does not collapse. This is not passivity. This is not withholding. This is not manipulation. This is a regulation under pressure, and something unexpected happens. The pressure changes shape. When urgency is present, pressure feels sharp. It feels directional. It demands action. It pulls behavior toward resolution. When urgency leaves, pressure becomes diffuse. It can be felt without being acted upon. It loses its command. This is what mutual regulation feels like at the beginning, not comfort, but permission. Permission for the moment to exist without being forced into an outcome. The field softens not because anyone did anything right, but because no one did the old thing automatically. Reciprocity does not begin with warmth. It begins with timing. When two nervous systems stop racing each other, a new pacing appears. Not synchronized sentimentally. Aligned enough that neither has to lead by force or follow by collapse. Most relational dysfunction is not about intention. It is about timing asymmetry. One system speeds up. The other compensates. One system cannot tolerate a pause. The other absorbs the cost. Over time, this becomes invisible. It becomes how we are. One person is decisive. The other is flexible. One person is emotional. The other is logical. One person is anxious. The other is calm. But underneath these labels is a simpler truth. One system collapses time. The other regulates for both. So when the system that used to regulate stops doing it, the field destabilizes briefly. That destabilization is often misinterpreted as conflict, but it is actually the first honest signal. The moment the field softens is the moment urgency is no longer doing the regulating. You can feel it physically. The room feels larger. The air feels less dense. Your attention widens instead of narrowing. You are aware of yourself and the other at the same time, instead of scanning for danger. You are not rehearsing your next sentence while the other is speaking. You are not calculating how to land safely. You are there. This is not intimacy. It is the condition intimacy requires. Because intimacy cannot survive speed. It cannot survive constant correction. It cannot survive explanation as defense. It requires time to register. So the atmospheric hook of reciprocity is this, the first shared pause that doesn't need to be fixed. It can happen between two people. It can happen in a group. It can happen in a room. It can even happen in a single body, noticing that the imagined other is no longer being managed. The key is that no one rushes to define the moment. Language often arrives late here, and that lateness is important, because when words arrive too early, they take over. They collapse the field back into cognition. They restore urgency in disguise. When words arrive later, they carry a different weight. They are not trying to rescue the moment. They are marking something that has already happened. In mutual regulation, response replaces reaction. Reaction is fast. Response has timing. Reaction is protective. Response is selective. Reaction tries to end discomfort. Response allows discomfort to inform. This is why reciprocity cannot be performed. The moment you try to be reciprocal, you reintroduce control. You start monitoring yourself. You start adjusting your behavior to meet an ideal. And the field tightens again. Reciprocity emerges when neither system is trying to be correct. Correctness is a form of urgency. It demands resolution. It demands agreement. It demands that ambiguity be eliminated. But reciprocity does not require agreement. It requires tolerance. Tolerance of difference. Tolerance of silence. Tolerance of incomplete understanding. The moment the field softens is often marked by something very small, a breath that completes, a sentence that doesn't get finished, eye contact that lingers without demand, a shift in posture that isn't defensive, a pause that feels shared rather than awkward. Most people misinterpret that pause as a problem to solve. They think something is wrong because nothing is happening. But what's actually happening is regulation synchronizing. You can feel this when someone stops trying to manage you. Their questions slow down, their tone loses its edge. Their listening becomes receptive instead of strategic. They are not waiting for you to finish so they can respond. They are with you. And when you stop managing them, the same thing happens on your side. You stop scanning their face for approval. You stop shaping your words to prevent misunderstanding. You stop carrying the emotional temperature for the space. This is why reciprocity often feels quieter than people expect. It lacks drama, it lacks intensity, it lacks the highs that come from urgency and resolution. But it has depth, and depth is only possible when the nervous system is not sprinting. There is also a grief that can surface here, because when the field softens, you may realize how long you've lived in acceleration. How many conversations have you steered? How many pauses have you filled? How often have you been the one to move first? How much of your connection was built on effort rather than presence? That grief is not a setback. It is the nervous system noticing contrast. Contrast is how learning happens. The body learns what regulation feels like by feeling its absence and then its return. It learns what reciprocity feels like by noticing how much work was required to maintain contact before. So if you feel unsettled in these moments, that is expected. The old system equated movement with safety. The new system is learning that stillness can be shared. The atmospheric hook here is not an idea. It is an invitation to notice the moment when nothing is being pushed, when neither system is trying to lead or follow, when the field is not being shaped by urgency. That moment is fragile at first. It can collapse easily if someone rushes to explain it, define it, or optimize it. But if it holds even briefly, something fundamental shifts. The field becomes a place you can be, not a force you have to manage, and that is the beginning of resonant participation. Etymology and definition. What is reciprocity? Reciprocity is one of those words that sounds inherently good. It carries moral weight. It suggests fairness, balance, and mutual care. And because of that, it is rarely examined at the level where it actually operates. It gets treated as a virtue instead of a condition, as an agreement instead of a physiology, as an outcome instead of a process. So this section does what this series always does when a word has been over-moralist. It strips it back to structure, not to make it colder, to make it usable. Etymologically, reciprocity comes from roots meaning moving back and forth, returning, responding in kind. The emphasis is not on sameness, not on equality, not on agreement. It is on movement, on response, on influence that travels between rather than being imposed from one side. That matters immediately, because most cultural uses of reciprocity have drifted away from movement and into accounting. Who gave more? Who owes what? Who is pulling their weight? Who is meeting the standard? Those questions belong to exchange, not reciprocity. So the first stabilization is this: reciprocity is not exchange. Exchange is transactional, it is discrete. It can be fair or unfair, but it is measurable. I give you this, you give me that. I meet your need, you meet mine. It can be explicit or implicit, but it is governed by balance sheets, even emotional ones. Exchange is useful in systems. It is useful in contracts. It is useful in commerce. But when exchange becomes the organizing principle of the relationship, the nervous system is never at rest. It is always calculating, always tracking, always adjusting to avoid deficit or exploitation. Reciprocity does not track units. It tracks the state. In reciprocity, influence moves back and forth without being tallied. One nervous system shifts, the other responds. One pauses, the other adjusts. One speaks, the other receives. One withdraws slightly, the other does not chase. There is no ledger being updated. There is only regulation occurring in motion. This is why reciprocity cannot be enforced. The moment you demand it, you have turned it into an exchange. The second distinction is equally important. Reciprocity is not agreement. Agreement is cognitive alignment. It is shared conclusions. It is a consensus. And while agreement can be pleasant, it is not required for reciprocity. In fact, many people mistake agreement for safety, and in doing so, they suppress differences in order to preserve the illusion of connection. Reciprocity does not require shared opinions. It does not require shared values. It does not even require liking. What it requires is that the difference does not collapse regulation. Two nervous systems can disagree profoundly and still be reciprocal if neither forces the other into urgency, defense, or self-erasure. Conversely, two people can agree on everything and still lack reciprocity if one is rushing, appeasing, managing, or overriding themselves to maintain that agreement. So agreement is not the marker, timing is. Then there is the confusion with harmony. Reciprocity is not harmony. Harmony implies smoothness, ease, lack of friction. But friction is not the enemy of reciprocity. Unregulated friction is. In many environments, people are trained to avoid tension at all costs. They equate tension with danger. So they smooth, soften, joke, placate, intellectualize, or disengage. They call this harmony. But often what they are actually doing is preventing the field from revealing its true state. Reciprocity allows tension to exist without escalation. It allows differences to exist without collapse. It allows discomfort to be felt without being immediately resolved. That does not look harmonious in the sentimental sense. It looks steady, and steadiness is far more important to nervous systems than surface calm. Now we address the most damaging confusion of all, reciprocity versus equality. This is where 50-50 thinking enters, and where nervous systems begin to fail. Equality thinking assumes symmetry. It assumes that each person must contribute the same amount, regulate the same way, show up the same, give the same energy, at the same time. It treats difference as an imbalance, and imbalance as injustice. But nervous systems are not symmetrical machines. They have different thresholds, different histories, different capacities at different moments. Forcing symmetry onto regulation collapses both sides. In real reciprocity, there are moments when one system is leading and the other is receiving. Moments when one is quieter and the other is more active. Moments when one is stabilizing and the other is being stabilized. That does not violate reciprocity. That is reciprocity in motion. What breaks reciprocity is not asymmetry. It is fixation. When one system is always leading and the other is always adapting. When one system consistently collapses time and the other consistently absorbs the cost. When one system sets the pace and the other never gets to choose it. That is not reciprocity. That is regulation outsourcing. 50-50 thinking collapses nervous systems because it ignores the state. It ignores timing. It ignores context. It turns regulation into a moral demand rather than a physiological process. People start performing equality instead of staying present. They force themselves to give when they are depleted. They withhold when they are full to avoid imbalance. They become managers of fairness rather than participants in contact. Reciprocity does not ask, is this equal? It asks, is influence flowing without coercion? That brings us to the next stabilization. Mutual regulation is not mutual responsibility. This distinction is critical. Mutual regulation describes what happens when two nervous systems influence each other's state through presence, pacing, tone, and timing. It is largely implicit. It happens whether you intend it or not. When one person slows, the other often slows. When one person tightens, the other often responds. This is not a choice. It is biology. Mutual responsibility, on the other hand, is an ethical or behavioral demand. It implies obligation. It implies that you are responsible for managing the other person's emotional state. This is where people get trapped. They hear mutual regulation and translate it into I must make sure the other person is okay. They become hypervigilant. They monitor tone. They adjust behavior. They preempt distress. They manage the atmosphere. They call it care. But it is often anxiety in the service of connection. That is not reciprocity. That is self-erasure. Reciprocity does not require you to regulate for another at the cost of yourself. It requires that you not force the other to regulate for you either. It is symmetrical in principle, not in action. So now we place the working definition cleanly, without moral residue. Reciprocity is the capacity for two nervous systems to influence each other without forcing timing, outcome, or self-erasure. Every word is deliberate. Capacity, because reciprocity is not guaranteed. It depends on the state. It depends on the environment. It depends on whether both systems can tolerate a pause. Two nervous systems, because this is not about personality, intention, or communication skills. It is about physiology in contact. Influence each other because there is no neutral interaction. Presence always affects presence. Regulation always entrains regulation. Without forcing timing, because urgency is the primary way reciprocity is destroyed. When one system collapses, the other must adapt or withdraw. Without forcing outcome, because trying to control how the other feels, responds, or decides turns contact into manipulation, even when intentions are good. Without self-erasure, because reciprocity cannot exist where one system repeatedly disappears to maintain connection. This definition immediately clarifies something uncomfortable but necessary. Reciprocity is not something you can achieve alone. You can restore agency alone. You can stabilize your voice alone. You can build a boundary alone. But reciprocity only appears when another system can meet you without collapsing into urgency. This is where many people experience disappointment. They do the work. They slow down. They stop managing. They stop over-explaining. They stop rushing. And they expect the field to become reciprocal automatically. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the absence of reciprocity becomes visible for the first time. Not because it wasn't there before, but because urgency was masking it. So reciprocity emerges after agency, not before. This is the first mirror linguistic hypothesis insertion, and it is structural, not aspirational. Reciprocity emerges after agency, not before. If one system lacks agency, it cannot tolerate mutual regulation. It will rush, appease, dominate, withdraw, or perform. It will attempt to stabilize the field unilaterally. That is not reciprocity. That is survival. And the second mirror linguistic hypothesis insertion clarifies how language fits into this. Language entrains the state before content. This means that how something is said regulates the field more than what is said. Speed, tone, volume, pacing, hesitation, silence. These are state signals. Content arrives later. In non-reciprocal contact, language is often used to control the state. People talk to soothe, to dominate, to appease, to fix, to prevent escalation. The words are doing regulatory labor because the nervous system cannot tolerate a pause. In reciprocal contact, language does less work. It does not have to manage the field. It follows regulation instead of creating it. Speech becomes responsive rather than strategic. This is why reciprocal conversations often feel strangely simple. Fewer words, longer pauses, less explanation. Not because people are withholding, but because regulation is already happening underneath. Now, a crucial clarification: reciprocity is not constant. It flickers. It appears in moments. It disappears under stress. It returns when timing is restored. It is not a permanent state you achieve and keep. It is a dynamic that emerges under certain conditions and vanishes under others. Treating reciprocity as a constant ideal is how people start blaming themselves or others when it disappears. But reciprocity is sensitive. It depends on capacity, context, and cost. So rather than asking, is this relationship reciprocal, the more accurate question is reciprocity possible here, in this moment? And the answer may change. Sometimes reciprocity fails not because someone is bad, but because the environment collapses timing. A workplace that rewards speed. A family system that punishes pause. A crisis that demands immediate action. In those contexts, reciprocity may not be available, no matter how regulated you are. Recognizing that is part of agency. So the purpose of this section is not to sell reciprocity as a moral good. It is to make it legible, to help you recognize when influence is flowing without coercion, and when it is being forced by urgency. Reciprocity feels like shared pacing, like neither person is dragging the other forward or holding them back. Like differences can exist without destabilizing the field. Like silence is allowed, like speech is not a defense. The outcome is not being managed, and when it is absent, it feels like effort, like someone is always adjusting. Like timing is always being negotiated implicitly. Like one system is carrying more load than the other. Like speed is doing the regulating. So we close this definition where it belongs. Reciprocity is not fairness, not equality, not harmony, not agreement, not exchange. It is a regulated influence moving back and forth without urgency, outcome control, or self-erasure. And that is why it belongs here, after agency. Because only when you can choose without urgency can you meet another nervous system without forcing it to adapt. In the next section, we will look at why this so often fails in real fields, why contact turns coercive even when intentions are good, and how timing asymmetry, not malice, is usually the root of relational breakdown. Cognitive hook. When contact turns into pressure, there is a shift that happens before anyone speaks, before intention forms, before conflict appears. It happens at the level of timing, and most people miss it because they are trained to listen for content instead. The moment contact becomes pressured is the moment timing stops being shared. Nothing dramatic occurs, no boundary is crossed, no rule is broken, but the nervous system registers it instantly. The space narrows, the pause shortens, the moment feels as though it must move forward. Silence no longer feels neutral, delay feels irresponsible, and without anyone deciding to control, control begins to operate. This is the cognitive hook of reciprocity, because reciprocity does not fail at the level of goodwill, it fails at the level of time. When two nervous systems meet, timing is the first thing they negotiate, not consciously, somatically. Breath pace, speech speed, turn taking, silence tolerance, response latency. These signals decide whether contact will remain mutual or become asymmetrical. And once asymmetry appears, pressure follows. Most people think relational pressure comes from disagreement. It doesn't. Disagreement can exist within reciprocity. Pressure comes from urgency, from the subtle insistence that something must happen now. This is why so many interactions feel coercive, even when no one intends harm. No one is forcing, no one is threatening. But one system cannot tolerate the moment as it is. And when one system cannot tolerate the moment, the other must adapt. That adaptation is the beginning of non-reciprocity. The cognitive mistake most people make is assuming that urgency equals importance, that speed equals honesty, that immediacy equals care, that resolving things quickly is mature. These assumptions are rarely examined because they are rewarded everywhere, in workplaces, in families, in relationships, in social norms that praise decisiveness and punish hesitation. So when urgency enters contact, it often feels justified. It feels responsible. It feels like doing the right thing. And that is precisely why it works as pressure. It does not announce itself as a force. It arrives disguised as virtue. Pressure does not require intention. Pressure is a property of timing. When timing collapses, pressure appears automatically. The nervous system reads it as a countdown. Act now, respond now, decide now, fix now, explain now, or risk consequence. Once that countdown starts, choice is already compromised. Most people do not notice this shift because they are already inside it. They notice the discomfort that follows, the anxiety, the irritation, the urge to explain or withdraw, and they attribute it to personality differences, attachment styles, communication failures, or unresolved issues. But those are downstream effects. The upstream event is always the same. Time stopped being negotiable. This is why the same people can feel completely at ease in one interaction and subtly coerced in another without being able to explain why. Nothing obvious changed. The topic might be benign. The tone might even be polite. But the pacing changed. The room tightened. The silence lost permission. This is the moment reciprocity breaks. The cognitive hook here is recognizing that reciprocity lives or dies by timing, not by agreement. Two people can agree on everything and still lack reciprocity if one cannot tolerate a pause. Two people can disagree strongly and remain reciprocal if both can hold timing without escalation. Content misleads. Timing tells the truth. When timing is shared, contact feels spacious even when the subject is difficult. You can think, you can feel, you can respond rather than react. When timing is coerced, even simple exchanges feel charged. Words carry weight they shouldn't. Silence becomes loaded. Neutral questions feel intrusive. The nervous system prepares for impact. At this point, the mind usually steps in to solve the discomfort. It looks for reasons. It tries to interpret intention. It asks, why does this feel off? And because the discomfort arrived during communication, the mind concludes the problem must be communication. So people try to communicate better. They explain more clearly. They clarify intentions. they refine tone, they set rules, they negotiate language, and none of it works for long because the problem was never language, it was timing. This is the second recognition of the cognitive hook. You cannot communicate your way out of a timing problem. When one system is rushing, the other cannot relax simply because the words are kind. When one system needs resolution now, the other will feel pressured, no matter how gently the need is expressed, because the body responds to pace before meaning. This is why urgency is such an effective regulator of behavior. It bypasses consent, it bypasses deliberation, it bypasses the signal, it collapses the option, and once the option collapses, reciprocity is no longer possible. The person on the receiving end of urgency may not consciously register it as coercion. They may simply feel compelled, compelled to answer, compelled to reassure, compelled to agree, compelled to explain, compelled to act. Later they may feel resentful or depleted and not know why. They may blame themselves for not having better boundaries. But the boundary was never the issue. The issue was that time was taken off the table. This is how hidden urgency operates. Hidden urgency is not panic. It is intolerance of incompletion. There is discomfort with leaving things open. It is the inability to let a moment remain unresolved without distress. It often presents as emotional intensity, logical insistence, moral pressure, or relational responsibility. It says, we shouldn't leave this like this. We need to clear the air. Let's just sort it out. I need an answer. We can't go to bed like this. Silence is not okay. Each of these phrases sounds reasonable. None of them is inherently abusive. And yet they function identically at the nervous system level. They remove the option to pause. Once the pause is removed, the other system is no longer choosing freely. It is responding under a time constraint. And any response under time constraint is shaped by threat prediction, not by internal reference. This is why people often make choices in relationships that they later don't recognize as their own. They agreed to something they didn't want. They said yes when they meant no. They explained when they wanted to stop talking. They stayed when they wanted to leave. They escalated when they wanted to slow down. At the time, it felt necessary. Later, it feels confusing. The missing piece is timing. Agency restored the capacity to choose without urgency. Reciprocity tests whether that capacity can exist in contact. The cognitive hook of this episode is realizing that contact itself can reintroduce urgency, even after agency has been restored internally. This is why phase 3 is not simply a continuation of phase 2. The self can be regulated alone and still lose coherence in a relationship if the field collapses in time. Resonant participation requires something new, the ability to stay with another nervous system without handing your timing over. That ability is fragile at first. When you stop rushing, the field often reacts. Silence stretches. The other person may push. They may fill the space. They may intensify language. They may accuse you of withdrawing, avoiding, or not caring. Not necessarily because they are manipulative, but because their own system experiences the pause as a threat. This is where many people abandon their own agency. They rush again to relieve the other's discomfort. They call it empathy. They call it care. They call it compromise. But what they are actually doing is regulating the field, and this is where reciprocity quietly disappears. The cognitive hook here is not asking you to judge who is right. It is asking you to notice who is allowed to slow down. In reciprocal contact, both systems are allowed to slow down. In non-reciprocal contact, only one is. The other must keep things moving. Once you see this, many patterns reframe themselves. Arguments that seem to be about content reveal themselves as timing battles. Conflicts that seemed personal reveal themselves as nervous system mismatches. Long-standing resentments reveal themselves as accumulated regulatory labor. This recognition can be unsettling, because it removes the story that someone is simply bad at communicating, or too sensitive, or too demanding. It reveals a structural problem that cannot be solved by trying harder. The structure is this: one nervous system cannot tolerate the moment, and the other is compensating. As long as that remains true, reciprocity cannot stabilize. The mind resists this recognition because it feels passive. It feels like giving up control. People want solutions. They want techniques. They want scripts. But reciprocity is not produced by technique. It is allowed by timing. The cognitive shift then is subtle but profound. Stop asking how to communicate better and start asking whether time is being shared. Is silence allowed? Is not yet allowed? Is delay punished? Is urgency framed as a virtue? Is resolution demanded for comfort? These questions cut through narrative and land directly in the body. You don't need to analyze them. You feel the answer immediately, and once you feel it, you cannot unsee it. This is where many people experience a secondary loss of innocence. They realize how often they have mistaken pressure for intimacy. How often was urgency framed as emotional honesty? How often speed was confused with care? How often they adapted because slowing down felt dangerous? This is not about blame. It is about literacy. Nervous system literacy. Reciprocity is not something you create by being nicer or more open. It is something that emerges when both systems can remain present without forcing the moment forward. The key reframe belongs here, at the cognitive level, because it reorganizes how the listener understands relational conflict before any somatic mapping or case study arrives. Most relational conflict is misaligned nervous system timing, not incompatibility, not lack of effort, not poor communication, but timing. When timing is aligned, the difference does not threaten. When timing is misaligned, even agreement can feel coercive. When timing collapses, urgency becomes the invisible hand that selects behavior. This is the hook that carries the listener forward, because once timing is seen, everything else reorganizes. You stop trying to win arguments. You stop trying to explain yourself into safety. You stop trying to fix people who cannot pause. You stop mistaking your own adaptation for generosity. And you begin to recognize the real question beneath every interaction. Is this moment being shared, or is it being rushed? That recognition is enough to change how you enter contact. It is enough to prepare the ground for the next section, where we leave cognition and drop back into the body to feel what mutual regulation actually feels like when timing aligns. For now, we hold the hook steady. Reciprocity fails not because people don't care, but because time stops being mutual. And until timing is restored, no amount of communication will make contact safe. The somatic blueprint, how mutual regulation feels if we named the problem cognitively, timing collapsing into pressure. This section brings the listener back to where reciprocity actually lives, not in behavior, not in intention, not in relationship rules. Reciprocity lives in the body, and it announces itself long before the mind assigns meaning to what is happening. Mutual regulation is not something you decide to do. It is something you feel when the conditions are right. And those conditions are physiological before they are relational. When reciprocity is present, the first thing that changes is not what is said. It is how time moves through the body. Breath is the earliest signal. In non-reciprocal contact, breath is recruited. It becomes shallow, strategic, or suspended. People inhale to speak, exhale to placate, hold their breath to endure, or sigh to discharge tension. Breathing is doing work because the nervous system is compensating for pressure. In reciprocal contact, breath is not recruited. It completes itself. Inhale follows exhale without interruption. There is no sense that breathing must be managed to survive the moment. The diaphragm moves freely. The rib cage does not brace. The breath does not hurry to keep up with speech or thought. What is striking is that this synchronization does not require imitation. One person does not consciously match the other's breathing. Instead, pacing aligns indirectly. When neither system is rushing, breath settles into a rhythm that can coexist. Not identical, compatible. This is the first somatic marker of reciprocity, breath that does not need to adapt to pressure. From breath, the next signal appears in the eyes. Eye contact in non-reciprocal fields is rarely neutral. It is often used to monitor, assess, persuade, or manage reaction. People look to check whether they are safe, whether they are being understood, whether the other is escalating, withdrawing, or judging. Eye contact becomes a tool of regulation. In reciprocal contact, eye contact loses its instrumental quality. It is no longer scanning for threats or approval. It comes and goes naturally. It can hold without intensity. It can break without rupture. There is no urgency to maintain it and no anxiety when it fades. This is why reciprocal eye contact often feels softer than expected. Not less present, but less charged. The eyes are not asking anything of the other nervous system. They are simply registering presence. When eye contact does not demand a response, the body recognizes safety. Reduced threat prediction follows. Threat prediction is the nervous system's constant calculation of what might go wrong next. In non-reciprocal fields, threat prediction is high. The body anticipates misattunement, escalation, rejection, or demand. Muscles brace. Attention narrows. Speech prepares defensively. In reciprocal fields, threat prediction drops. Not to zero, but enough that vigilance relaxes. The nervous system no longer needs to stay ahead of the moment. It can afford to be slightly behind it. That temporal shift is everything. When threat prediction reduces, speech changes. In pressured contact, speech is often defensive even when the content is benign. People explain preemptively. They justify choices that were not challenged. They clarify intentions before anyone asks. They soften statements to avoid reaction. Words arrive early and in excess because they are doing regulatory labor. In reciprocal contact, speech emerges later. It does not rush to fill space. It does not overspecify. It does not try to manage the outcome. Words feel optional. Silence and speech carry similar weight. This is a crucial distinction. Reciprocity does not mean more talking. It often means less, but no less because of withdrawal. Less because regulation is already happening underneath, so language does not need to perform. When speech is no longer defensive, tone changes as well. Prosody, the musical quality of speech, flattens healthily. Not monotone but unforced. There is less pitch volatility driven by anxiety, less sharpness, less urgency. Pauses appear within sentences. Pacing slows without effort. Prosody is one of the most powerful state signals between nervous systems. Long before words are processed, tone communicates safety or threat. In reciprocal contact, prosody signals availability without demand. The voice does not pull or push, it rests. This is why reciprocal conversations often feel strangely easy to follow, not because the ideas are simpler, but because the nervous system is not burning energy tracking a threat. Cognitive load drops. Reduced cognitive load is one of the clearest physiological indicators of reciprocity. When you are not monitoring tone, pacing, facial expression, or outcome, mental bandwidth returns. You can think while listening. You can feel without rushing to interpret. You can let meaning arrive instead of chasing it. From speech, the body signals extend into posture. In non-reciprocal fields, posture is rarely neutral. Shoulders lift, the neck tightens, the jaw braces, the torso leans forward to engage or pulls back to protect. Muscles hold readiness. The body is prepared to act quickly. In reciprocal contact, posture settles, not slumped, not rigid. Weight is distributed evenly. The spine supports without tension. the jaw loosens, the tongue rests, the shoulders drop without effort. There is no need to be poised for immediate action. This is not passivity, it is readiness without alarm. One of the most overlooked somatic signals of reciprocity is warm silence. Silence in non-reciprocal fields is rarely neutral. It is often interpreted as withdrawal, punishment, or threat. The nervous system fills it with projection. Something is wrong, something is coming. I need to do something. Warm silence is different. It has texture, it feels inhabited. There is a sense that both systems are present, even though no one is speaking. Silence does not demand resolution. It does not provoke anxiety. It does not collapse into awkwardness. Warm silence only appears when neither system is trying to lead or follow. This brings us to the core somatic truth of reciprocity. In non-reciprocal contact, nervous systems organize around roles. One leads, one follows, one pushes, one yields, one escalates, one absorbs. These roles may switch occasionally, but the structure remains. Timing is asymmetric. In reciprocal contact, those roles dissolve, not because power disappears, but because timing is shared. Neither system is responsible for moving the moment forward. Neither system is responsible for holding it back. Influence moves in both directions without being forced. Embodied rather than conceptual. Reciprocity is the body recognizing it does not have to lead or follow. When the body recognizes this, regulation changes immediately. The nervous system no longer needs to predict what the other will do to survive the interaction. It can afford to respond rather than preempt. Neurobiologically, this maps onto vagal co-regulation. The vagus nerve mediates social engagement, pacing, and physiological safety in proximity. In reciprocal contact, vagal tone supports connection without collapse. Heart rate variability stabilizes. Breath deepens. Facial muscles soften. Voice prosody signals safety. The system remains flexible rather than rigid. Importantly, vagal co-regulation is not about synchronizing perfectly. It is about compatibility, not sameness. Two nervous systems can remain distinct and still regulate together. Reciprocity does not erase difference. It stabilizes it. Reduced threat prediction in proximity is the outcome of this compatibility. When the body no longer expects harm from closeness, proximity becomes tolerable, not euphoric, not intoxicating, simply available. This is why reciprocal contact often lacks the intensity people associate with connection. It does not spike dopamine through urgency or drama. It does not flood the system with adrenaline. It does not rely on activation to feel alive. Instead, it offers steadiness. For nervous systems accustomed to chaos, steadiness can initially feel dull or unfamiliar. Some people misinterpret this as a lack of chemistry, but what they are actually feeling is the absence of threat-driven arousal. Reciprocity does not feel exciting in the way urgency does. It feels grounded, spacious, sometimes even quiet. But within that quiet, there is depth. This depth allows something critical to return: choice. When mutual regulation is present, choice re-enters the system. You can choose when to speak. You can choose when to pause. You can choose whether to engage or disengage without penalty. Options widen instead of narrowing. That widening is not cognitive. It is somatic. You feel it as a room inside your chest, as time inside the moment, as the absence of countdown. This is how the somatic blueprint directly aligns with the cognitive shift. The cognitive shift showed how timing pressure collapses choice. The somatic blueprint shows how shared timing restores it, not through agreement or behavior change, but through bodily state. Reciprocity is not created by matching effort. It is created by a compatible regulation. When both systems can tolerate a pause, influence flows naturally. When one cannot, reciprocity collapses regardless of intention. This is also why reciprocity cannot be sustained by one person alone. You can slow your breath. You can soften your posture. You can reduce your urgency. But if the other system continues to collapse over time, your nervous system will eventually have to choose between adapting again or withdrawing. Reciprocity appears when both systems independently have the capacity to remain present without forcing an outcome. When that happens, the body recognizes it immediately. There is a sense of relief that does not come from resolution, a sense of being met without being managed, a sense that you do not have to perform your state for it to be acceptable. This is the somatic signature of mutual regulation, and once you have felt it, it becomes a reference point. You can recognize when it is present. You can recognize when it is absent. You can feel when contact is asking you to lead, follow, or disappear. And that recognition informs agency without requiring explanation. In the next section, we will ground this physiology in lived experience, moments where neither system rushes, where old patterns would have escalated, and where mutual regulation either stabilizes or fails. But for now, the blueprint is complete. Reciprocity is not a behavior you adopt. It is a bodily condition that emerges when timing is shared, when breath settles without effort, when eye contact is not demanded, when speech is not defensive, when silence stays warm, when the body recognizes it does not have to lead or follow. That is how mutual regulation feels. Field case study. When neither system rushes, this case study matters, because reciprocity does not become real through description alone. It becomes real when the field behaves differently. And the mirror linguistic hypothesis gives us language for why that difference is felt before it is understood. MLH begins from a simple premise. Language does not primarily transmit information. It entrains the state. Words, tone, pacing, silence, and response timing act as mirrors that reflect and shape nervous system organization in real time. Meaning follows regulation. Content arrives after the field has already decided whether contact is safe. With that in mind, consider a conversation that would once have escalated, not explosively, not obviously. Escalation here is subtle and familiar, a tightening of timing, a sense that something must be handled correctly or quickly, a background pressure that turns ordinary exchange into a task. In the past, this moment would activate the mirror linguistic field immediately. One nervous system would begin broadcasting urgency through microsignals, faster speech, compressed pauses, forward-leaning posture, intensified eye contact, and questions that arrived too quickly. None of this would be intentional. It would be the body signaling, this moment is unsafe unless it moves. Under MLH field theory, those signals do not stay contained. They reflect, they invite response. The other nervous system would mirror the acceleration without choosing it. Breathing would shorten, language would become denser, explanations would appear preemptively, tone would soften or sharpen depending on prior conditioning. The field would organize around urgency before any explicit disagreement occurred. That is how escalation begins in most interactions, not with content, but with mirrored timing. Now place the same moment after agency has stabilized in both systems. The topic arrives. The same potential friction exists. The same difference is present. But the mirror linguistic field behaves differently because neither nervous system broadcasts urgency. The first thing that changes is silence. There is a pause after the topic appears, and that pause is not linguistically marked as danger. No one rushes to fill it. No one mirrors tension through rapid speech or a corrective tone. In MLH terms, the silence is non-directive. It does not demand completion. It does not imply threat. It simply exists as shared time. Because language entrains state before content, this silence already does regulatory work. It signals, this moment can be held. In the old pattern, silence would have been linguistically loud. It would have carried implicit messages, disapproval, withdrawal, tension, expectation. The field would tighten. Someone would feel compelled to speak to repair the rupture that silence represented. Here silence stays warm. Warm silence is not empty. It is saturated with presence. The body remains oriented toward the other. Eye contact may soften or break without rupture. Breath continues without recruitment. No one prepares a sentence in advance. The nervous systems remain responsive rather than predictive. This is the first visible MLH shift. Language withdraws its regulatory burden. When one person eventually speaks, the speech does not arrive as a controlling signal. It is not dense with justification. It does not attempt to stabilize the field through explanation. The tone is unforced. The pacing is slow enough to allow reflection. Pauses appear inside the sentence rather than only between turns. Under MLH, this matters more than the words themselves. The speech does not demand mirroring. It does not pull the other system into acceleration. It invites response without coercion. The other person receives this speech without immediately translating it into defense or repair. They do not mirror urgency because none is being broadcast. Their nervous system does not have to compress time to stay safe. They listen while staying connected to their own signal. This is reciprocity at the field level. Influence is present, but it is not directional. One system does not lead while the other follows. Instead, influence oscillates. Speech affects the field. Silence affects the field. Presence affects the field. But none of these signals force the forces move. This is where MLH clarifies something critical. Reciprocity is not about matching behavior. It is about compatible state signaling. In the old pattern, one system's urgency would have required the other to compensate. The field would have demanded symmetry through adaptation. Here symmetry is unnecessary because timing is shared. As the conversation unfolds, something that once triggered escalation appears again, a statement that carries potential impact. Previously, this would have activated immediate linguistic defense. The speaker would have rushed to soften, explain, or justify. The listener would have prepared a response before the sentence finished. Now, the statement lands without immediate correction. The field absorbs it. There is sensation, a tightening, a warmth, a recognition, but it does not translate instantly into language. Under MLH, this is the moment where the signal is allowed to complete before meaning is assigned. This is rare. Most people are trained to assign meaning instantly because meaning stabilizes threat. But here, meaning is delayed. And because it is delayed, it is not weaponized. It is not used to manage the other system. No one fixes. Fixing would reintroduce urgency by implying that the field cannot tolerate impact. No one performs. Performance would broadcast safety artificially instead of letting it emerge. No one disappears. Withdrawal would remove the signal and destabilize the field. The mirror linguistic field remains coherent because no one sends a directive signal that collapses timing. This is mutual regulation in action, not as a concept but as a lived field phenomenon. Notice how language behaves here. Fewer words appear, but each carries more precision. Not intellectual precision, but state fidelity. The words match the nervous system state instead of compensating for it. There is no excess, no padding, no urgency to be understood. The mirror linguistic hypothesis describes this as language following regulation rather than leading it. When language leads, it attempts to shape the field. When it follows, it reflects the field. In reciprocal contact, language becomes reflective rather than manipulative, even unintentionally. As the exchange continues, timing remains fluid. One person pauses longer, the other does not rush them. Later, the roles reverse. Adjustment happens, but it is not predictable or fixed. This is how we know reciprocity is present. No one consistently adapts first. In MLH field theory, this indicates that regulatory load is not being outsourced. Each nervous system carries itself while remaining responsive to the other. Eventually, the conversation reaches a natural resting point, not closure, not resolution, saturation. The field signals that enough has been exchanged for now, and that signal is recognized without disappointment or anxiety. This is another critical MLH marker, the absence of linguistic residue. In non-reciprocal interactions, language leaves behind debris, replay, rumination, the sense that something must still be said, the need to process the interaction because a regulation occurred. In reciprocal interactions, there is little residue. The nervous system does not need to revisit the exchange to restore equilibrium. This is how people often recognize reciprocity only after the fact. They notice the absence of exhaustion, the absence of resentment, the absence of confusion. The body feels complete without explanation. That completion is not cognitive, it is somatic. From an MLH perspective, this is the clearest evidence that the field remained coherent. Language did not override the signal. The signal was allowed to complete. Timing was shared. This case study also reveals why reciprocity cannot be simulated. If one person attempts to slow down while the other continues to broadcast urgency, the field will destabilize. The slower system will feel pressure. The faster system will feel frustrated. Language will start doing regulatory work again. Reciprocity requires independent agency in both systems. That is why it sits here, in phase 3. The self must be able to tolerate a pause alone before it can tolerate it together. When neither system rushes, the field reorganizes automatically. Language simplifies. Silence stabilizes. Influence becomes bidirectional without negotiation, and something essential returns to contact, the sense that no one is being managed. This is the lived truth of reciprocity as understood through the mirror linguistic hypothesis. Not an ideology, not a moral stance. A field condition in which language mirrors regulation instead of compensating for its absence. The case study does not end with advice. It ends with recognition. Recognition of how different contact feels when timing is shared. Recognition of how often urgency masquerades as care. Recognition that reciprocity is not something you do to another person, but something that appears when neither system collapses over time. In the next section, language itself will come back into focus, not as content, but as field behavior. Because once reciprocity stabilizes at the somatic level, words no longer need to manage safety. They can follow the signal and in doing so, restore meaning without pressure. For now, this case study holds the central insight of episode 8 in lived form. When neither system rushes, the mirror linguistic field remains coherent, and reciprocity becomes possible without performance, fixing, or disappearance. Language and reciprocity. When words don't manage the field, language changes when reciprocity appears, not because people decide to speak differently, but because words are no longer required to regulate the field. This is the quiet shift that often goes unnoticed. People assume communication improved because they said the right thing. In reality, the nervous system stopped asking language to do a job it was never designed to do. Under the mirror linguistic hypothesis, language is not primarily informational. It is regulatory. Tone, pacing, prosody, timing, hesitation, silence. These elements entrain the state before meaning is processed. Content arrives after the field has already decided whether contact is safe. When reciprocity is absent, language is recruited to stabilize the field. When reciprocity is present, language is released from that burden. This is the difference this section names. In non-reciprocal contact, speech functions as leverage. Not necessarily manipulative leverage, but regulatory leverage. People speak to move the moment, to soothe discomfort, to prevent escalation, to close the uncertainty, to secure reassurance, to reassert control, to avoid silence, to ensure they are understood before being misunderstood. Words arrive early, often too early. Sentences are dense, explanations stack, clarifications multiply, tone is shaped deliberately, pace accelerates. Language is doing heavy lifting because the body cannot tolerate the pause. This is why non-reciprocal conversations are exhausting. It is not the disagreement that drains energy. It is the constant linguistic management of safety. In reciprocal contact, that labor disappears. Speech no longer arrives as a preemptive strike against uncertainty. It arrives after the signal, after sensation. After the timing has settled, the body speaks because it is ready, not because silence is intolerable. This is why reciprocal language is often simpler, not simplistic, but economical. Fewer words carry more weight because they are not compensating for instability underneath. Pace slows without effort. Pauses appear naturally inside sentences. Silence is allowed between turns. Importantly, this reduction in language is not withdrawal. Withdrawal removes signal. The reciprocal quiet preserves it. When language follows regulation rather than leading it, something fundamental changes. Words stop trying to control the outcome. In pressured fields, people speak to influence how the other will feel, respond, or decide. Even when intentions are kind, the function is the same. Language is used to manage reaction. This is why people often feel subtly coerced, even during calm conversations. The words are shaped to elicit a specific response. Reciprocity removes that function. Words are no longer aimed at the other's nervous system as a target. They are offered into a field that can already hold differences. Because the field is stable, language does not need to be strategic. This is why reciprocal language often feels less persuasive, less polished, sometimes even less impressive. It is not optimized. It is not trying to land perfectly. It is simply accurate to state. Accuracy here does not mean factual precision. It means state fidelity. The words match the internal signal. Nothing is added to protect. Nothing is removed to placate. Nothing is exaggerated to be heard. Under MLH, this is a critical point. Language that mirrors the state without distortion preserves coherence. Language that compensates for instability distorts it. When reciprocity is present, the speaker does not monitor the listener's reaction while speaking. They are not scanning faces, adjusting mid-sentence, or correcting tone in anticipation. Attention remains inside and in contact simultaneously. This dual awareness is only possible when the field is not demanding immediate regulation. The listener, in turn, does not treat language as a cue for action. They do not feel compelled to respond immediately. They do not translate words into threat or obligation. They allow meaning to arrive without rushing to resolve it. This is where reciprocity restores something essential to language, and that is time. Time allows meaning to unfold instead of being forced. Time allows nuance to exist without being explained. Time allows misunderstanding to be tolerated briefly without panic. Time allows silence to do its work. In many environments, time is removed from language. Fast responses are rewarded. Hesitation is penalized. Silence is interpreted as incompetence, avoidance, or lack of care. Language becomes compressed. People speak quickly and often, not because they have more to say, but because delay feels unsafe. Reciprocity reintroduces temporal spaciousness. It allows words to arrive at their own pace. It allows conversations to breathe. It allows the body to remain oriented while language unfolds. This is why reciprocal conversations often feel slower but clearer, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being rushed. Another key shift occurs in how silence is interpreted. In non-reciprocal fields, silence is linguistically loud. It is filled with implied meaning. It demands interpretation. People rush to assign intent. You're angry, you're disengaged, you're judging me, you're withdrawing. Silence becomes a problem to solve. In reciprocal fields, silence loses that interpretive load. It is no longer treated as a message that must be decoded. It is simply part of the exchange. Silence becomes non-directive language, a signal of presence without instruction. Under MLH, silence is not the absence of language. It is a linguistic element with regulatory impact. When silence is allowed to exist without threat, it stabilizes the field more effectively than words ever could. This is why the phrase "we need to talk" often feels threatening. It collapses silence into urgency. It announces that language is about to be used to manage something. Reciprocity removes that anticipatory pressure. Conversation can begin without preamble because the field is already stable. The shift in language also changes how disagreement is handled. In non-reciprocal contact, disagreement triggers linguistic escalation. People defend positions, marshal arguments, explain intent, and justify perspective. The goal is often not understanding, but stabilization. Words are used to regain footing. In reciprocal contact, disagreement can remain localized. It does not spread through the field. Language stays close to the point. There is less need to generalize, escalate, or defend identity. The disagreement does not threaten the relationship because timing is not collapsing. This is a profound change. It allows differences to exist without becoming a referendum on safety. Under MLH, this happens because language is no longer tasked with protecting connection. Connection is held by regulation, not by agreement. Words are free to describe reality rather than secure it. Another subtle change appears in listening. In pressured fields, listening is often strategic. People listen for openings, for threats, for opportunities to respond. They prepare their reply while the other is still speaking. Language becomes competitive, even when polite. In reciprocal fields, listening becomes receptive, not passive but unhurried. There is space for the speaker to finish without being interrupted by the listener's internal narrative. This receptive listening further stabilizes the field, creating a feedback loop. Less pressure allows better listening reduces pressure. This loop is fragile at first. It can collapse if urgency returns, but once experienced, it becomes a reference point. People begin to recognize when language is being used to manage the field versus when it is simply reflecting it. This recognition changes how you relate to your own speech. You begin to notice when words arrive too early, when explanations appear before the signal has settled, when you feel compelled to speak to relieve discomfort rather than to express something real. These moments become information rather than mistakes. You also begin to notice when fewer words feel more accurate, when silence feels complete, when waiting does not cost you safety. These are signs that reciprocity is present. The key insight of this section belongs here, placed cleanly and without embellishment. Reciprocity restores language by removing pressure. Pressure is what distorts language. Pressure compresses timing. Pressure recruits explanation. Pressure turns words into tools of regulation. When pressure leaves, language returns to its proper function, reflecting state, marking experience, sharing meaning without coercion. This does not mean language becomes perfect. It becomes honest in a quieter way. It becomes less defensive, less performative, less strategic. It may even become less impressive, but it becomes trustworthy, and trustworthiness is what language was meant to serve. As we move toward the final sections of this episode, the focus will narrow further. Observation will replace explanation. The listener will be invited to notice where language rushes, where silence tightens, where words attempt to manage the field. Not to correct it, not to optimize it, just to recognize it. Because once you can feel when language is being used to control timing, you no longer confuse speech with connection. You can allow words to arrive when regulation is already present. And when that happens, reciprocity no longer has to be negotiated. It simply appears quietly in the space where pressure used to live. Observation practice noticing mutual timing. This section is not an exercise. It is not a technique. It is not a way to improve your relationships. It is an invitation to notice something that is already happening without intervening in it. Reciprocity cannot be installed through effort. The moment you try to create it, you turn timing into a task and pressure returns. So this practice is deliberately passive. It asks for attention without correction, perception without strategy. The object of observation is not behavior. It is timing. Timing is the earliest signal of how a field is organized. Long before content becomes difficult, timing reveals whether contact is shared or coerced. Who moves first? Who waits? Who accelerates? Who absorbs? Who can pause without cost? So the first invitation is simple. Notice who rushes. Not just verbally. Rushing is not only fast speech. It shows up as quick questions, as immediate responses, as discomfort with silence, as filling gaps, as pushing for clarity, as wanting to sort it out, as tightening when nothing happens. Notice rushing without assigning blame. Rushing is rarely malicious. It is usually a learned survival strategy. A nervous system that learned early that delay equals danger will collapse time automatically. That collapse does not require intent. When you notice rushing, do not interpret it. Do not respond to it. Do not correct it. Just register that timing has shifted. Then notice who adapts. Adaptation often looks like care, softening tone, explaining more, reassuring, agreeing prematurely, adjusting pace, managing atmosphere. It can be so familiar that it feels like personality rather than a response. Notice adaptation without self-judgment. Adaptation is not weakness. It is often intelligence applied under constraint. The nervous system chooses the least costly option available in a pressured field. What matters is not whether adaptation occurs, but whether it is predictable. Does the same system always move first? Does the same system always carry the pause? Does one person consistently absorb urgency so the other doesn't have to feel it? These patterns are not conclusions. They are information. Next, notice the silence. Silence is the most honest diagnostic of mutual regulation. Words can deceive. Silence cannot. Notice when silence feels safe. Not comfortable necessarily, but inhabitable. A silence where breath continues, posture stays open, and attention remains present. A silence that does not demand resolution. Then notice when silence feels tense. Not because something bad is happening, but because the nervous system expects something to happen. A silence that feels like a problem to solve. A silence that triggers explanation, humor, reassurance, or withdrawal. The difference between these two silences has nothing to do with content. It has everything to do with timing tolerance. Silence that feels tense is a silence that has been stripped of time. It is a silence under a countdown. Silence that feels safe is silence with permission. As you observe these moments, resist the urge to explain them to yourself. Explanation recruits cognition too early and turns observation into management. Stay with sensation instead. What happens in your body when the pause stretches? What happens in your jaw? What happens in your chest? Do you feel pulled to act or able to wait? These questions are not prompts to answer. They are anchors to keep attention in the body while timing reveals itself. This is where the mirror linguistic hypothesis operates quietly in the background. Language is not being analyzed. It is being felt as a signal. Tone, pace, and silence are registered as state information rather than meaning to interpret. When you observe without intervening, something important happens. The nervous system begins to learn timing directly. This learning is not conceptual. It is neuroplastic. At a basic level, nervous systems entrain to each other automatically. Pace synchronizes, breath aligns, prosody adjusts. This happens whether you want it to or not. But when you add awareness, a different layer of learning occurs. The system begins to discriminate. It begins to recognize the difference between shared timing and collapsed timing, between mutual pause and coerced pause, between silence that holds and silence that threatens. This discrimination reduces cognitive load. In non-reciprocal fields, the mind works overtime. It monitors, predicts, simulates, prepares responses, tracks the other person's state. This constant simulation is exhausting, even when interactions appear calm. When timing is shared, the simulation drops. The mind no longer needs to stay ahead of the moment. Thought slows, attention widens, presence increases. This reduction in cognitive load is often felt as relief without euphoria. Observation strengthens this effect because it interrupts the reflex to manage. When you notice timing instead of reacting to it, you prevent urgency from selecting behavior automatically. This does not mean you never act. It means the action is delayed long enough for the signal to arrive. Importantly, this practice is not about watching the other person to diagnose them. It is about noticing the field. Timing does not belong to one individual. It emerges between. If you notice someone rushing, also notice what happens in you. Do you speed up? Do you slow down? Do you feel pulled to fix? Do you withdraw? These responses are not personal flaws. They are conditioned regulatory strategies. The goal is not to stop them. The goal is to recognize them before they become compulsory. There will be moments when you observe rushing and feel the urge to counterbalance it by slowing down deliberately. That urge is understandable, but be careful. Deliberate slowing can become another form of management. It can feel corrective. It can create friction. The instruction here is simple and strict. No fixing, no mirroring, just noticing timing. No fixing means you do not intervene to stabilize the field. You do not smooth tension. You do not accelerate resolution. You do not offer reassurance to make the pause tolerable. You allow the field to reveal whether it can hold itself. No mirroring means you do not intentionally match pace, tone, or energy to create harmony. Mirroring can be useful in some contexts, but here it becomes performance. Performance reintroduces pressure. Just noticing timing means allowing the moment to unfold while staying oriented to your own signal. This is more challenging than it sounds because many people equate care with action. Doing nothing can feel irresponsible, especially if you have been the one who historically carried the regulation. But notice what happens when you do not act immediately. Often, the field reorganizes on its own. The other system may slow down, or it may escalate. Both outcomes are information. If it slows, reciprocity becomes possible. If it escalates, reciprocity is not available in that moment. Neither outcome requires correction. Both outcomes require clarity. This practice also applies internally. Notice when you rush yourself, when you demand answers before the signal has formed, when you push for decisions to relieve discomfort, when you translate sensation into meaning prematurely. Self-rushing is often rehearsed in a relationship. The way you treat your own timing is the way you will treat shared timing. So when you notice internal urgency, apply the same rule. No fixing, no mirroring, just noticing timing. This is where agency and reciprocity intersect. Agency allows you to notice urgency without obeying it. Reciprocity tests whether that capacity can exist in contact. Over time, this observation practice builds a new reference point. You begin to feel when timing is mutual and when it is not. You begin to trust that feeling more than narratives about how relationships should work. This trust is quiet. It does not announce itself as confidence. It feels like reduced compulsion. You are less compelled to speak, less compelled to explain, less compelled to resolve, less compelled to stay, less compelled to leave. Options widen. That widening is the nervous system learning that time can be shared. This practice does not promise comfort. Sometimes noticing timing reveals that reciprocity is rare in certain fields. That recognition can bring grief. But grief is preferable to confusion. It restores orientation. The aim here is not to become better at relationships. It is to become literate in timing. Once you can feel timing, you no longer confuse urgency with intimacy, speed with honesty, or silence with threat. You can participate where reciprocity is possible and step back where it is not, without blame. So keep this practice light, unforced, non-intrusive. Notice who rushes, notice who adapts, notice how silence feels, and then do nothing with that information except carry it forward as sensation. Self-reflection prompt gentle internal contact. This is not a reflection you complete. It is a question you allow to sit in the body without answering. No journaling, no analysis, no fixing. The question is simple. Where do I speed up to keep the connection? Do not look for examples. Let sensation respond first. Notice where the body tightens as the question lands. Notice any impulse to explain, justify, or move on quickly. Those impulses are not obstacles. They are the signal. Speed shows up in many forms. It can be fast speech. It can be immediate reassurance. It can be humor arriving early. It can be a decisive agreement. It can be over-clarity. It can be the urge to close a moment before it opens too far. You are not being asked to stop any of this, only to recognize it. Notice where speed feels like care. Notice where slowing down feels risky. Notice where pause feels like it might cost you connection. Do not correct these sensations. Let them register. This question is not meant to produce insight. It is meant to restore timing awareness. When you feel where you speed up to keep the connection, you are already touching the edge of reciprocity. That is enough for now. Integration. Reciprocity is not agreement. Reciprocity is often confused with agreement because agreement feels calm. It reduces friction. It resolves the difference. But agreement is a cognitive event. Reciprocity is a physiological condition, and the two are not the same. You can agree and still be pressured. You can disagree and remain reciprocal. This is the first integration point to anchor. Reciprocity is not harmony. Harmony implies smoothness, lack of tension, emotional ease. It is often achieved by smoothing the difference before it can be felt, by softening edges, by avoiding disruption, by maintaining tone. But harmony can exist without reciprocity if one system is doing the work to keep things smooth. In that case, harmony is a product of adaptation, not mutual regulation. It looks calm on the surface and hides one system underneath. Reciprocity does not require smoothness. It requires shared timing. Tension can exist inside reciprocity without escalation. Discomfort can be present without collapse. Silence can stretch without threat. So if harmony depends on speed, explanation, or avoidance, it is not reciprocity. It is management. Reciprocity is not compromise. Compromise is a behavioral negotiation. Each side gives something up to reach a middle point. It can be useful. It can be fair. But it does not guarantee mutual regulation. Many people compromise under pressure. They agree to something quickly to relieve tension. They have conceded to restore calm. They give up the signal to preserve the connection. That is not reciprocity. That is self-erasure disguised as cooperation. Reciprocity does not require meeting in the middle. It requires meeting on time. Two systems can remain distinct, hold different positions, and still be reciprocal if neither forces the other to move before the signal has formed. When compromise happens inside reciprocity, it is chosen. When it happens outside reciprocity, it is extracted. Reciprocity is not responsibility for another's state. This is perhaps the most important reframe. Mutual regulation does not mean mutual responsibility. You are not responsible for calming a nervous system at the expense of your own. You are not required to manage reaction, prevent discomfort, or ensure emotional outcomes. When people confuse reciprocity with responsibility, they overfunction. They monitor constantly. They adjust preemptively. They speak to soothe. They silence themselves to protect. They believe this is care, but it is often fear translated into service. Reciprocity removes that obligation. In reciprocal contact, each system carries itself. Influence still occurs, but it is not coerced. You are affected by the other without being responsible for regulating them. They are affected by you without you managing that effect. This is what makes reciprocity feel lighter, because nothing matters, but because regulation is not outsourced. So we place the core line here not as a slogan, but as a structural truth. Reciprocity is presence without pressure. Presence means you are there with your signal intact. Pressure means timing is being forced. When presence exists without pressure, reciprocity becomes possible. When pressure enters, reciprocity collapses regardless of intention. This integration matters because it protects the work from moral distortion. Without it, people turn reciprocity into another standard to meet, another way to judge themselves or others. They try to be more reciprocal. They perform slowly. They withhold strategically. They monitor themselves into rigidity. That is not reciprocity. That is performance wearing a common mask. True reciprocity cannot be performed because it depends on conditions, not effort. Both systems must be able to tolerate a pause. Both must have access to agency. Both must allow timing to be shared rather than controlled. Sometimes that condition exists, sometimes it doesn't, and recognizing the difference is not failure, it is literacy. Integration then is not about achieving reciprocity everywhere. It is about recognizing where it is possible and where it is not, without self-betrayal. When reciprocity is present, contact feels grounded. You are neither pulled forward nor held back. You do not feel responsible for keeping things okay. You can stay, speak, pause, or leave without urgency. When reciprocity is absent, contact feels effortful. Speed increases, explanation expands, silence tightens, choice narrows. Recognizing that does not obligate you to fix it. It gives you information. This is the quiet maturity of phase 3. Not mastery, not control. Discernment in contact. Reciprocity does not promise closeness. It promises clarity. It tells you when the connection is mutual and when it is maintained by pressure. It tells you when language is reflecting the state and when it is compensating for instability. It tells you when presence is enough and when it is being demanded. So we anchor the integration cleanly. Reciprocity is not harmony. Reciprocity is not compromise. Reciprocity is not responsibility for another's state. Reciprocity is presence without pressure, and when that is true, contact becomes something you can enter without losing yourself, and leave without collapse. Reciprocity does not resolve the field. It reveals it. That is the final movement of this episode. Not closure, but orientation. When mutual regulation becomes possible, something subtle but decisive happens. Misalignment becomes visible without blame. What once felt like conflict is recognized as a timing mismatch. What once felt like distance is recognized as asynchronous regulation. What once felt personal is seen as structural. Reciprocity does not smooth these differences away. It exposes them without pressure. And that exposure is necessary because aligned participation cannot be built on hidden asymmetry. You cannot stabilize what you cannot see. You cannot integrate what is still being compensated for. Reciprocity removes the compensation. This is why the transition from episode 8 to episode 9 matters. Reciprocity reveals misalignment by withdrawing urgency. When urgency leaves, the field shows its true pacing. You see where inner timing does not match outer demand. You feel that participation costs more than it should. You notice where you have been adapting to maintain contact and where others have been adapting to you. None of this requires confrontation. It requires clarity. That clarity is not cognitive. It is somatic. You feel when your internal rhythm aligns with the environment and when it doesn't. You feel when participation stabilizes you and when it drains you. You feel when being present costs nothing and when it costs you. This is where coherence enters. Coherence is not agreement between people. It is the alignment between the inner signal and outer participation. It is the condition where what you feel, what you say, and what you do are moving at compatible speeds. Not identical speeds, compatible ones. Reciprocity makes this possible by removing pressure. Once pressure is gone, you no longer have to choose between authenticity and connection. You can sense whether the field supports your timing or demands you override it. This is the bridge into episode 9. Coherence integrates inner and outer timing. It is not about consistency of belief or behavior. It is about rhythm. When your internal pacing can meet the pacing of the world without collapse, participation becomes sustainable. Without reciprocity, coherence is impossible. You cannot align with an environment that forces speed. You cannot stabilize participation in a field that punishes pause. You cannot remain coherent where urgency selects behavior. So reciprocity is not the destination. It is the diagnostic threshold. Once you know whether mutual regulation is possible, you can decide how to participate. You can engage where timing aligns. You can renegotiate where it doesn't. You can step back where participation would require self-erasure. And you can do all of this without urgency. That is the quiet power of phase 3. Participation no longer means compliance. It no longer means endurance. It no longer means performance. It means entering fields where your nervous system can remain intact. Episode 9 will take this further. It will explore how coherence stabilizes participation without collapse, how inner reference can remain intact in outer complexity, how alignment is felt rather than asserted, how coherence differs from certainty, control, or conviction. For now, this episode closes where it should, with the recognition that reciprocity is not something you achieve, but something that reveals whether participation is viable. When neither system rushes, the field tells the truth, and that truth is what coherence will organize around next. Next episode, episode 9, Coherence, Inner and Outer Alignment. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix, Volume 3, a Mirror Linguistic Hypothesis series, The Silencing Field, Return to Self, Episode 8, Reciprocity and Mutual Regulation. I'm James Miller.